a teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Okay, can the kids come back, Derek?
The kids can come back, guys. I've heard a couple things I wrote down. He brought up
Yeah.
the Hindu the ages and the time for the Hindu writings, and so it was 864. I know that the Sumerian kings list has 432,000 years, and that is the 10 kings of the Sumerian list, which is half of the 864, which these numbers all play together. I wrote down a few things that were in the Old Testament Exodus. Moses was in the wilderness, and 70 ancients were with him. They received the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Two of them, Mildad and Medad, were back at the camp. Then you had 72 descendants of Noah. And then you also had I'm just thinking of a few things off the cusp. There's 72 Buddhas on the temple in Indonesia, the statues of Buddha. And so it's like, oh, wow. I mean, there's a lot going on here. But anyway.
So, Derek, I'm looking at the text itself, you guys. And in that passage in Luke, it talks about the harvest 3 times, right? He says the harvest is plentiful. And then he talks about the Lord of the harvest sending out laborers into his harvest. So harvest is obviously a very important word. And that phrase, his harvest, if you look at the gematria of it, the numerical value of the letters, I talk a lot about gematria, but it happens to be 72 times 23. So it's even embedded in that passage in Luke in some interesting ways.
Very interesting, Luther. That is, and that's something that is your specialty. I love that. This number 72 is unbelievable, and this is just one number. How many did we have listed? Woo!
We had 4, Derek. We had 4 numbers. And so did you want to say something else about the 72, Alan, before we transition to the next number?
Well, as we saw, so it connected to sun, earth, moon, geometry, had musical aspects, it had connections to, weights and measures. Now, what you'll find is that each of these numbers has multiple layers, which will include the quadrivium will be repeated throughout, but they'll also have an overlap with one another, and this will not only be expressed in man-made measurements, so a foot or a meter can be officially changed, but a lot of this begins with the actual natural measurements and the natural. So the day, the month, and the year are natural cycles of time, and they've been observed since the ancient times, and then since then we've created, we've defined our own measurements, but there are natural cycles of time, natural cycles of the distance between the Earth and the Moon isn't something that we can affect, or the distance between the Earth and the Sun. So these are built into the universe, and so if we begin, we'll come to those. But yeah, beginning with natural cycles of time and how these sacred numbers and measurements connect to what cannot be changed, what cannot be, what's not arbitrary amongst the systems. But just like Derek mentioned before, this is one of the numbers we'll be coming back to is 163. And so, for instance, John 10 with the 153. Yeah, 153, but the net was not torn. I doubt because of its connections to alchemy, but that's the vesica. So what I have here is just to simplify it. But okay, before I go into 153, we've already completed with 174, and so this is the vesica, and it's really I've got a rectangle around the outside, but it's just 2 circles. It's one circle, and then the second circle is drawn with its center on the other, so they're balanced. Now, this is the basic construction of, you could call it sacred geometry, but also Euclidean geometry. It's one of what you've already done is create like a 90 degree angle, so you have like a drawing template, but we also have math and astronomical knowledge embedded. And this is now one way you could think about the geometry we'll talk about is that it's universal geometry. So whether you're on Venus or Alpha Centauri, these rules of geometry and math will apply to you wherever you are. They're constants across the universe. And so there are certain proportions built in now. And we'll see it referred to in many ways now. Well, to begin with, okay, so with the Vesica now we have, call that the almond, the mandala, which is one of the names that religious artists use to describe this section here. Now, if I was to turn it sideways, it looks like an eye, or it even looks like a fish. So that's one of the connections to this portion in the center. There's different ways and different names for it. But the width of that almond to the height of that almond is, well, it's exactly the square root of 3. So it's this very important piece of mathematical knowledge that can be accessed through Pythagorean theorem. But the best whole number approximate of this very important number is 265 over 153. So this is one of the connections of 153 to the net. Now, well, for instance, I live in Sydney. That's the capital city of my state. The capital city of Australia is Canberra, and the second biggest city is Melbourne. But what you'll find is, it's 153 miles from Sydney to Canberra, and then it's 153.00 feet from Canberra to Melbourne. And Australia's actually, you'll find, okay, now maybe I'm jumping the gun now, so I'll go back to, we're talking about the Vesica and Vitruvian man. And so that number 72, which I mentioned, it's connected to the pentagon or the pentagram, which is a perfect description of phi. And so in ancient, whether it's the pyramid or the Parthenon, what you'll have is the golden number emerging from there. Now that's an example of a pentagram inside a pentagon, but has an expression of how it connects to the golden ratio. So this particular number you can't actually write down as a number. It just goes on forever and ever. It's one of those, incommensurate numbers, as they call, like pi. Pi just runs on forever and ever. So the golden number is very similar. So to write it down as a number is almost impossible, or probably is impossible. But what you can do is draw it perfectly in geometry. So in geometry, it can be represented perfectly, and the perfect way to get the golden number or the divine proportion, it is embedded inside the pentagram and the pentagon. So, for instance, if this green portion is 1, then the red portion is phi. Or if the red portion is 1, then the yellow portion is phi. So and as you break it down, all the ratio, so that's one of the reasons why the pentagram on pentagon is very important, and this will also relate to that Vitruvian man. So this golden number has a interesting aspect. So when a baby is born, their omphalos, or their navel stone, their belly button, will be halfway up their body. So it's at a 1-to-1 ratio. But as you grow, and that changes into a 1-to-5 ratio when you're fully grown, your height to your navel. And even Fibonacci numbers, such as 3 and 5, that you have 3 parts of your arm and you have 5 fingers. And so you'll often see these Fibonacci numbers as well repeated. And so what you have again is architecture, mythology, geometry, and these sacred numbers coming back to one another. So it's so you see a Fibonacci.
Real quick, Alan, while we got the pentagram going on, because that's Satan worship, of course. We want to get our conspiracy guys on this thing here, right? Anyway, the pentagram, is that in the Bible? Is there anywhere that can kind of give an indication that and I say that because most of our context of our audience would be aware of the Bible. Does any of this, I know the numbers play a role, but do you know if there's a pentagram kind of concept somewhere in the Bible?
No, I couldn't. That's a good question. I wouldn't say the Star of Solomon. I've always heard to be the five-pointed star, but I don't know whether that's been referenced in the biblical text. No.
Alan, what do you think about being able to represent something perfectly in a graphic sense, and yet the math doesn't quite work out? Isn't that interesting how you can draw it and it looks perfect to the eye, but when you try to work out the math, it's not so neat. The numbers don't come out just right. What does that say about the relationship between what we can do visually and what we're able to work out logically in terms of math?
Well, especially, yes, when it comes to structures, there's a big difference between what you can do on a piece of paper and how you apply it in real life. For instance, you can build a house perfectly. You build it in spring, but in summer it's going to expand because of the heat, and winter it will contract. And so structures always have this living sense to it, so that's a theme. But what I think it's also one of the brilliant features of this is that actually the margins of error are done in such a way in the greater structures that they actually contain complementary information. If not, the margin of error actually is the key to another deeper level underneath, and that will.
That's right. Wow.
So
that's incredible.
I mean, my head is like soup by now. This is amazing. So there's what blows me away is that these people, these authors of these texts, were aware of all of this. And I mean, just studying one subject in this is like, whoa. But everything from the three parts of your arm, you got your hand, and then from your wrist to your elbow to the shoulder, and the 3, and then the 5, and I mean, just knowing your entire anatomy, knowing nature, knowing all this stuff, you had to be, I don't know people today who actually practice and know all of these elements together. I'm not saying there aren't people who are really good at doing this or doing that, but I just don't know them, I just don't know them, Luther. I don't know them, Alan.
That's one of the downsides, I think, of, firstly, because our technology is so specialized. It's before you were a biologist, but now you'll tend to study in a certain field of biology, or before you sort of just become an engineer. But now it's so often there's a specialist type of career path you can go in engineering or any profession. But the same we see in the school system, where we have a specialization. Everything is broken up into strict topics. So in math, you don't have anything to do with music. In science, you don't have anything to do with rhetoric. Every subject is separated, and I think that's this 7 liberal arts will blend with one another, because firstly we have the quadrivium, which can be weighed and measured. It's a subjective, it's a guaranteed truth, it's a foundation for law. So whether it's trade law, business or land tax, we have a foundation stone where we can all agree on a language that we can all talk about and measure. But those are very clear black and white areas. But then the trivium especially deals with the grey areas. Now, the trivium is rhetoric, logic, and grammar. Now, those are the skills which would be most valued in the court of law, because you need to debate, you need to make your arguments passionately. So it's not just about the evidence; it's also how you present the argument through your rhetoric. The grammar. So if you're a business lawyer, you can, with the wrong apostrophe or you miss a period in a sentence, this can have huge effects on a business contract. So these skills, but that's now you're dealing with law, and these are grey morality, what's right or wrong. These are grey areas, but it's sort of where the trivium and the quadrivium come together, because at least we have a basis. You agreed to pay this much and send this much wheat on this day at this time, and I was going to pay this much. It's in the contract. Here's the measures. Here's the dollars. We agree on this, and so it's the same. I'll look at some Bible quotes and the importance of morality, and even other cultures that will sin or the Ten Commandments, especially the books of Lord Deuteronomy, Leviticus. Will have multiple references to, one of the best ways to behave and do well and not sin is to be honest with your weights and measures. But that's also a metaphor for your dealings with people, because like with so much of these scriptures, there's the literal physical aspect, but there'll also very often be a underlying psychological or moral aspect to these stories as well as, and again you can interpret these in different ways, but when it comes to weights and measures, it's at least a solid piece of like we really know what someone's talking about when they say the weight scale or the measuring rod. These are very definite items. Now their meaning can vary, the intensity of the metaphor can vary, but whether it's a term such as yardstick is still a common term for a gauge of truth. You have the expression yardstick will also, you're trying to measure truth somehow, or a square deal, as in like a builder's square. It's still, or on the level. Now these are all Masonic phrases, but they're actually much older, because it's, the house is built on the level. He's an honest builder. It's a square deal. These symbols of honest weights and measures, and that we've built these things on a true foundation. And that's why so much of it's...
Or even, Alan, being straight with someone, right? As opposed to being crooked. It's a geometric metaphor.
Exactly.
Okay.
And these things that,
Alan, finish that thought and talk about the stone the builders rejected, please, because this is unbelievable, bro.
Okay. Well, I'll go. Where is the... Give me a moment. I'll just find the folder. So amongst... just construction in general, and so I'll begin with. So in a biblical sense, so this will be repeated in the Bible, but this is also connected to Masonic law and very important in building major public buildings, and that's grain, oil, and wine. And so these are symbols of food, of fertility, of prosperity as well. A bit of sort of luxury too, but you'll find in Deuteronomy. Is it 11? For in grain, your wine and your oil. Now that's there'll be Joel 2 in 19. Behold, I am sending you grain, wine, and oil. And Nehemiah 5, and then again 10, sort of grain, oil, and wine. So it describes physical items, but they're also symbols of wealth, prosperity, and also of good faith as well. You'll find the Levites now. The book of Numbers, wine, grain, and oil will be mentioned. Now, why it's important? So, for instance, it's the labourers who worked on Solomon's temple paid their wages in grain, oil, and wine. So this is a Masonic gift pack that they give amongst one another. So when you reach a certain level, it's also the members will send it to one another as this sort of treat. Now you'll also see the grain, oil, and wine ceremony in funerals, and so Eastern Orthodox especially will add grain, oil, and wine during there. But it's used again, this Masonic symbol, and now sometimes it'll be called corn, oil, and wine, but that's just another grain. And so these are vessels they would use in the Masonic. So this is a cornerstone ceremony, and what you have is grain, oil, and wine will be spilt on the cornerstone, and that's like giving birth. One of those ceremonial features. So in these truly sacred cathedrals, major public buildings, these are meant to. You want to do the building beautifully and perfectly because it's going to be at the center of your city, and it's sort of like a message for what you want your country to be. So you want the
something on that note. It sounds to me, eat of my flesh, drink of my blood. You've got the grain, and you have the blood, and I believe there is some oil somewhere in this story. If I'm not wrong, please correct me here, Luther.
Well, yeah, Derek. What about the Holy Spirit? The anointing is talked about in terms of an oil, right? I mean, that's part of it.
and they still have, for instance, when during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, they only took the camera off her for a short period, and that was during the anointing ceremony, which it seemed, for some reason they wouldn't show that part on camera where she was anointed with oil, which again is a common theme in biblical, but still very important in the royal circles as well, and even the instruments they use. But that's a whole other long story we could go into sometime maybe. But so we've major public buildings, they'll still invite masons to do the cornerstone ceremony, still around the world, because masons are the only people who have this ritual. So it's like there's not many, there's no other really organization or ritual still doing it. So it's they're using essentially the same principles of feng shui as well. We can go into that as well. But so it's one of the reasons for masons doing it is because no one else does these. This is one of the functions that masons, oddfellows, druids, and these organizations are good at. They've been doing this for centuries and connected with it. So that's one of the reasons for the ceremonial aspect of it. Now this is an example of a cornerstone ceremony. I think it's Missouri capital, but after 100 years, they're relaying the cornerstone, and what you'll see there is they're measuring and testing the stone with a square and with a level. So with a level, you have like a small string, a pendulum hanging to get it level, and they also test it with the builder's square. So this is part of this procedure, but you'll find it in or major public buildings. It's one of the ceremonies to begin with. And
Hey Alan, you were talking about the arrangement of things and how Masons are very careful about that. I had an experience along those lines in a church in which there was a meeting coming up, and the guy who was organizing the meeting was a Mason. And he insisted on being the one to arrange the chairs in the meeting. So there was something going on with the chairs. It may have been in terms of who was going to sit there and in terms of positioning and power relationships, but it may have been just the arrangement of the chairs themselves or some combination thereof. Masons are very interesting people.
Indeed,
Yes.
indeed. Now, Alan, all right, because look, we've covered some of these numbers. We've covered the fact that there's something, in my opinion, you said it. I didn't say it. The Masons are the only ones who practice this kind of cornerstone ritual. And when I was getting in recovery and I was staying at a person's house, mind you, her husband is a Freemason and he was part of the Scottish Rite. And he was telling me that he is a firm believer that their tradition goes all the way back into antiquity, and that there's just been this continuity of passing down this wisdom, which I never put two and two together when I was there. I'm learning this stuff now. But either way, he's saying this stuff is not new. This stuff comes from the Bible. This stuff is... So what if we're talking about a secret society speaking parables, telling you sacred geometry? Anyway, I'm starting to rabbit trail. What do you think about getting into the next number, Luther? How do you... something to segue into more numbers and patterns and showing... There's a bigger picture going on here, man, than what we thought.
Derek, we can get as deep as we want on any one of these numbers, but that's just giving the listening audience a little taste about what it's all about. I think it's great. We can proceed to another number that I'm sure everybody has questions about, and that is, I bet you can guess what it is. Anybody? It's 140. Yes, 144. That's it, Alan. And so I've got some scriptures. All right, here's Revelation chapter 7, verse 4, and then I'm going to skip to Revelation 21 and read verses 15 through 17. I'm going to go right through, okay? Okay, here's what it says. It says, "And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies foursquare, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. Tell us about that.
Well, now you've hit the nail on the head. There are certain 144 will be once more will not only join astronomy, units of weights and measure, music and these other themes, but it's especially one that's very rich in ancient traditions, and especially in the Bible it really stands out, and the usages of it are quite wide. And so I'll run through some quick examples of 144. So you have your 5 platonic solids. Now the octahedron itself is 1440 degrees, but if you add them all together, it's 14,400 degrees. So that defines one of the platonic solids, but it also defines all of them together. So this is Neoplatonic. Sorry, I've got a cat screen. Now, earlier again, I mentioned that the hexagon, and we'll be bringing that back. Well, earlier we showed the inside angles, add them together, you get 720. But now if we add the outside angles of a hexagon, we get 1440 degrees. Now, there are 1440 minutes per day. So the number of degrees inside of a hexagon is 720. That's how many minutes in a 12-hour clock face. But in the complete day, there are 1440 minutes. So the inside of a hexagon, in a way, defines a 12-hour clock face, and the outside defines the 24-hour and links those to minutes. Now, once again, screen resolution. So it's in the computing. In the technical world, they're still using these numbers because of the proportions in there now. Even now, modern day monitors are at a 16:9 ratio, but I think at least you will probably be old enough like me to remember the old-fashioned 4:3 screen. Now, 4:3,
right?
4 squared is 16, 3 squared is 9. So 4:3 square is 16 and 9, and that's your 16:9 screen resolution. Now, this applies to the Vesica Pisces as well. So from the old 4:3 to the new 16:9 is actually within the same general area of sacred geometry and what an ideal proportion is, because setting up the standard of a screen sets up all the cameras that are going to be made, all the TV shows, all the technology, the factories have to set at that standard, and they'll be working from that. And so to move from firstly to start with 4:3 and then to move to 16:9, these were no small decisions. They would affect all sorts of aspects of our lives, even the way movies are shot now, because 16:9 is wider. So even whether it's TV movies or old-fashioned, they had to change even the way they frame their shots, because now it's moved from old-fashioned 4:3. So the octahedron, which is connected to air, you'll find the 5 platonic solids that connect to air, earth, wind, water, fire, and the dodecahedron connected to heaven. But this is now same theme again, where we'll see they'll connect to astronomy, geometry, music, and arithmetic. Now 1440, I've already mentioned the long foot. Well, the sun and the moon, the sun and the moon, both convert into the long scale at 144. There are 1440 minutes per day. Now, in the long scale, in rods, that's 24 with 5 zeros, but so 24 hours per day, long rods, 1440 minutes per day measuring on Earth, but then both the sun and the moon. So again, it's like a good example. So even though the Earth itself doesn't convert to this measurement, that the units surrounding the Earth convert through this measurement and will complement the other systems. So sun, Earth, moon, measuring time, measuring distance.
Hey, real quick, Alan, and you're going to continue. I just want to make this point. It's like a spider web. You can't look at one thread. It all connects, but we're looking at one thread right now, ladies and gentlemen. And look, we've had some talks with Alan, me and Luther. I hate to segue because I'm not trying to do that, but we are only looking at one thread. And Alan has taken us probably through 6 among billions of threads, and we're like, hold on, there's more. Hold on. There's more? So 144 is the topic, but I'm just saying you can't have 144 and not have 72. You can't have 144 and not connect it somehow to 108 to 288 to 153 to they're all connected. So anyway, I just want our audience to be aware that these things tie together at some place.
Excellent. Thank you. So another common theme you'll see, firstly, is the Fibonacci spiral. And now you could also, I'll just be referring to the Fibonacci because that's the most famous, but this is it's made of numbers, but if you draw it as a geometric object that creates this spiral. So you're familiar with seashells and sunflowers, or so much of nature, plant and animal, is connected to this Fibonacci spiral. Hurricanes, as we saw, even spiral galaxies follow this rule because it's a very simple rule with a Fibonacci number. It's 1 + 1 is 2, and then 1 + 2 is 3. 3 + 5 is 8, and so it's a natural rate of growth expansion. But it also creates these beautiful numbers. Now, the 12 Fibonacci is 144. We'll come to that too.
Hey, Alan, with a Fibonacci number, an easy way to do it is in the series, you take the last two numbers and you add them to get the current number. If you want to know what the next one is in the series, take that number and the one before it and you add it and you just keep on with that process.
Yeah,
exactly. Would that be
Yeah, and what will happen is that the range between them will come closer and closer to the golden number. So 89 divided by 55 will be, I can't remember the exact number, but will be 1.612. And then 55 divided by 34 will be 1.6, and the further you develop it, but that's this golden ratio, so it's connected there. But there we see the Fibonacci numbers, there we see them listed, and to 144. So the 12 Fibonacci is 144, but 12 squared is also 144. So we have a nice connection in that sense.
In the Bible, when it talks about the 12,000 from each tribe too, it seems like we're dealing with calculation, man. It's telling you 12,000 from each tribe, and there's 12 tribes, and you have your 144,000. So I just feel like that was a good point to bring that in because it's a huge interpretive issue out there, in my opinion, and this is really interesting.
Okay, so here's another. All these numbers are also beautiful in arithmetic or a math sense that they're connected to multiple dimensions. You can do all sorts of lovely number tricks with them. So, for instance, 3 to the first plus 4 squared plus 5 cubed equals 144. Now, if we were to continue that pattern to plus 6 to the 4th power, so it's the same one, just now we add 6 to the 4th, we get 1440. So this is just one example of how these numbers will actually interact with one another on this 4D. I'll be using the harmonic numbers now, but that's not the only way to look at these numbers. I think there are many sort of deeper ways. But what we have here is a common theme, and we spoke about this, mentioned this before, but there are multiple dimensions to this. So in the literal mathematical sense, it's very helpful to think of it in multiple dimensions, like first, second, third, because working in, you'd understand the trade. So when you measure something in one dimension, you'll measure the length of a shelf, but then you want to know how much cover you need to have the top of a shelf. So you measure the length and the width, and then you have area, which is second dimension. Then you want to know that the television will fit into there, so you need to do a 3-dimensional, measure the height, the width, and the depth. And so these levels of dimensional thinking are actually like they apply to us in our life and everything we buy. It's whether you buy a can of drink or a bag of food, weights and measures are connected in there, and even standard sizes. So the drink cup in a car is if one manufacturer if they built cans short and stubby, it wouldn't fit in there. So there are all these little standards that apply to every day, and some of them are written down in law codes, a lot of them, and some of them just developed by market forces and what's popular with people. But
Alan,
carry on,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Go.
Well, I had the pleasure of looking at that screen you had up, the one you just had up, where you had 144 and 1440, which adds a 0. And so I was looking at the pattern as you see it: 3 plus 3 raised to the first power, 4 raised to the second, and 5 raised to the third. And then that same thing, but for 1440 on that second row, you've got 6 raised to the fourth. So I tried it. I said, well, let me see. It can't be that if I go according to that pattern, the next would be plus 7 raised to the sixth. So I had time to do that just before the show, and yes, it worked out. So if you do that second row and you say plus 7 raised to the fifth, yes, it comes out to be what you would expect, and it is 1440, but add a 0. I mean, this is just magic. It's fantastic.
Well, I never expand. I've only ever taken it to the fourth dimension for certain reasons, but yeah, that's very, yeah. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, but I can't say I'm surprised either, because that's just one of these patterns that keep re-emerging, and it's you get to a point where I was stunned by all of it, and surely it can't be true, and you just follow through with a relatively strict set of rules and patterns. So a small group of measures, a small group of proportions, and what you'll just find is that, and then every time, and there's never a day when something like that won't pop up, some sort of synchronicity, or you realize that you can extend this further, and it especially the math, that is a pattern, and nature is built on these sort of math patterns. So however you think about it, there is application for this to every facet of both the natural but also organizational systems that we have. And
Go ahead, Alan. Keep going with 144, because I've seen you've pulled up cathedrals, temples, for crying out loud. Did you write the Bible, man? Because I'm just...
Yeah.
I've just absorbed every sort of source I could get my hands on, and try to be open-minded. In my early days, a big breakthrough was I had a particular day where I said, okay, I'm going to forget everything I think I know, and I just basically read through the encyclopedias to get to relook at mythology and history, and I had to educate myself, especially on the Greek and Roman gods, because they were so important in studying the temples connected to them, which lead to different units of weights and measure. And then you see that these Bible references and Greco-Roman gods have direct connections to ancient India, Egypt, Sumeria, and it's part of a system. And so again, you will see weights and measures, so ancient Roman scales, which you could essentially the same as the Greek, but we'll see 144. Now I'll show there grains. So grains, you can measure inches. 3 grains is an inch, but you'll only really hear about it now when they talk about firearms and they're refilling a bullet. They'll say this many grains of shot is being put in there. So that's one of a few references where we still hear grains as weight. Another one will be, when they quote the gold and silver price, they'll quote it in the troy ounce, which is a slightly different ounce to the food ounce, but a troy ounce is 480 grains, which in the net which is a harmonic number and connects to here as well. But what you'll find is that they've chosen a particular system. So ancient weights and measures will contain number and proportions, which is geometric, and therefore has aspects to astronomy, arithmetic, and just the and one of the key points is that especially coin making it's one of the greatest tools of authority and power, was to stamp your coin with the king's head on it. For millennia now has been a very social but also economic symbol as well, and the development of a coin sort of really revolutionized trade in a lot of ways. Now they were trading precious metals, but the idea of a stamped coin, because it would be of a guaranteed weight and it would be of a guaranteed size. And as this developed, this also has a lot to do with systems of power now. So just following the same theme with 144, so I think but in Australia here is an interesting thing. Our AM radio dial is set up at 9 kilohertz differences. So it jump. I noticed yours in America not the same, but in Australia they set it up so that because it jumps at 9, our AM radio, all the stations will be on important numbers. So 1440 kilohertz or 1530 of the frequencies which you'll find our stations at. So at least here. Now this will also apply to FM, but we'll get to that in 108, for instance. And so whether it's in geometry, so hexagons, but once more the vesica Pisces, and the 240 degrees is equal to 1440 minutes of the compass. And then they have a nonagon. Now a nonagon is a complicated, technically impossible to draw with compass and straight edge, but where it's bar high, also you see nine's a very important number. So, but geometrically, the hard angle of a nonagon is 40 degrees, which is 2,400 minutes or 14,000 seconds of the compass. Now, that is on its own not too much, but then we have to consider the number 40. So, for instance, 40 days wandering in the 40 years in the Sinai, Jesus 40 days in the wilderness, and then 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Jerusalem was ruled by King David, ruled for 40 years in total. 33 were from Jerusalem, but 40 years in total. So you'll often see this reference to 40, but I won't go into that for now because it's actually, now, so again, with the 144 Sun, Earth, and Moon, like through time, it connects through geometry. Now, it's a beautiful number in math. Now, you mentioned the fifth dimension, okay? So Euler's conjecture about the fifth dimensional powers, and if you can add them up, I'm not sure if you're getting the whole view there, but so this top corner of the page is one of the shortest math papers ever written, and it was just to show that 144 in the fifth power, you can add them up together. So it's a special number in that way. It's that first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, as you pointed out, dimensional connection with 1440. The Fibonacci numbers, but also the 12th Fibonacci being 12 squared. Now, this actually applies to other Fibonacci and triangular numbers. So what we see, and again, won't be enough time in this, but numbers such as 108, as we'll look at, will link back to 55, and 55 is a Fibonacci number, but it's also a triangular number. It's 1 plus 2 plus 3, etc., up to 10. And so what you'll see is then, the same connections that happen in all of these numbers, in that they're lovely in as squares or cubes, or that they have these third, first, and fourth dimensional properties, and that they're Fibonacci numbers. These are the ones that re-emerge, not just in the dimensions of the buildings, but also proportionally. So you'll see the same Fibonacci ratios defining the buildings, whether it's pyramids. But staying on 144, also the Mayan calendar, the Baktun, that's 144,000 days. So it's one of these calendar systems of the Mayans. Now the Satya Yuga, that's 1,000,007. So I won't be using the zeros, so we can just say, okay, so 1728. Now that's also immediately a link to New Jerusalem, because at 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000, that's 1728 is 12 cubes. So the volume of New Jerusalem is 1728 with a series of zeros at the end. Now that will also link to 144, but just to say the numbers either mentioned or implied, because when they give a dimension of New Jerusalem, they're implying area and volume as well. They won't specifically say that, but as we'll see, there's some very important connections in New Jerusalem and the Epic of Gilgamesh. But with the Yuga, we have the same number. And as I said earlier, it's not just a solid border. There's a period of entry, then there's the main body of the Yuga, and then an exit, and that's defined by either 144,000 years, entry and exit, but 1,440,000 years has the main body of that. So we see cycles of time.
Hey, Alan, the and that 1728, which, as you pointed out, is 12 to the third power. 12 times 12 times 12. If you take half of that, you've got 864.
That's
and
and
half of that
is 4.
It's 432 and down to 216. So we're talking about all these precessional numbers. But if you just half it to 864, it works with the gematria too, because the numerical value of Jerusalem is 864. So they even made the numerical values work out to everything you're saying.
I'll try to remember. I'll put the link to the site. I'll pull it out. But there's a movie called Pi, Faith in Chaos. But there's one particular clip from there, and I'll put and send you the link. You can put in a description where in this movie he's approached by a Orthodox rabbi, and they talk about numbers and how the gematria connects to Fibonacci numbers especially, and how father, mother, and child, the tree of life and the Garden of Eden, have these connections to this, rather sophisticated math in a sense, yeah. And so we have ancient units of time and these numbers connecting. So the next one, this is now New Jerusalem. So we have Revelations 21:16, where they describe New Jerusalem 12,000 furlongs wide, long, and high. And also in 7:4, where we have 144,000, so 12 tribes and 12,000 per tribe, giving us these numbers. So it's and it's mentioned now. I haven't got a card prepared for it, but to also think about Genesis 1. And so we have 6 days of creation, and on the 7th day he rested. So 6 days times 24 hours is 144 hours. So you could say for 6 days of work, 144 hours, and then 24 hours of rest. Now, that makes 168 hours per week. This is another number which embeds links as well. But so I'm not just cherry picking the 6 and the 7, but they actually work together quite wonderfully, and one of these common sort of themes. But so if you see New Jerusalem, so just to start off with, they also mention the height of the walls of New Jerusalem to be 144 cubits. So that's 1,500 miles each edge length. That's exactly converts. Now, I should also say I'm using furlong here because the King James Bible quotes it as furlong. Older texts would say stadia, but what happened was Queen Elizabeth I said in the modern English units of measure that we use now, Edmund Gunter was the mathematician, theologian, clergyman, teacher of geometry that set up a lot of these official standards that we use. And so in Queen Elizabeth and Edmund Gunter set what is a furlong or a chain, because one furlong is 660 feet. You'll only hear about furlong usually in horse racing. They'll say it's so many furlong to the finish post. So one furlong is 660 feet. And one furlong is made of 10 chains of 66 feet. So this Gunter's chain, but I'll be saying, so basically my point, is that the King James version of the Bible varies from older ones because they mention furlong. The King James Bible is written directly after Queen Elizabeth I. So we also have a unit to measure, like a clear and definite unit, as where the older stadia can be confused because there are many versions across time. But to begin with, you have New Jerusalem, the wall height is 144 cubits. So the total edge length, so a cube has 12 sides, you add up 12 times 12,000 furlong, you get 144,000 furlong describes the edge length. Now the area on each side is 12,000 by 12,000, therefore the area of each face is 144, so many zeros, units squared, furlongs squared. Now, it just so happens as well that 12,000 of the modern English furlong happens to convert to 144 and a whole series of zeros in the Royal Babylonian scale of measurement, which is the one we'll be using to measure the Epic of Gilgamesh, which will repeat these exact same themes. But there will be... Now, New Jerusalem itself is a massive conversion tool that will unite multiple sets of ancient measures. But 144 is just one aspect to think of it about. So I already saw geometry, so 3-dimensional geometry, the octahedron.
Before you leave there, real quick, Alan, I just figure I'd tell our audience, because it's important with what you showed. I don't want to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. I want you to do that, so I'm not trying to steal any thunder, but The 144 cubits, you're the one who brought it to my attention, is a cubit is a foot and a half. We saw that at the beginning when you started showing us the stone with the measurements. So a foot and a half is 1 cubit. So technically, 144 cubits is 216 feet. What's interesting about that, and because we see this number 9 all over the place, I mean, you could break the number down, 144, 1 plus 4 plus 4 is 9, is you talked about Genesis, and you said in 6 days there's 144 hours. So the young Earth creationists are correct in saying these are 24-hour days. They're just wrong in saying, hey, this is when the Earth was made, okay? And then the old Earth creationists are correct in saying, look, this stuff scientifically is old. But they're not so correct in saying these are ages and not necessarily 24-hour structures. And it's trying to base something off time and measurement. And it tells you clearly on day 4, these are for signs, seasons, times. You know, it's telling you what you need to know. But anyway, I'm rambling. I just figure I'd say, if you take 9 days of time at 24 hours, you have 216 hours. So the 144 is 6 days. Flip a 6, you got a 9, okay? 9 days is 216 hours. We keep seeing 144 and 266 interchange, and we see that with the number 666. Not trying to rabbit trail. Everybody, I learned this from Alan. I'm just saying.
Well, that's like you mentioned the spider webs before, and that's what I think it's like wherever you are in a spider web, you got a direct route to the core. You know, the spider web vibrates. Everything is joined, and it looks very complex. But it's just even spider webs some of them are designed by a Fibonacci spiral. So they start with a few threads, and then they just spiral out in a Fibonacci. So that's another aspect of it. But what we have is that wherever you join on, you will have a direct path to the center of it. So whether your number is 144 or 72 or 108. Whether you look at it in an artistic sense, whether it musically or as a design sense, or as pure geometry, this will always bring you back to here. But I'm just focusing on these weights and measures because this is like, it's like for a skeptic or an atheist, okay, well, here it is to be measured, and we can find it still in the modern world, and it will predict the new cathedral or the new major skyscraper or the major parliament building will always follow these patterns. So it's not just describing the past and present. It seems to be, it's always worked so far for me, that it predicts, new major infrastructure work. So including things like the Suez and Panama Canal. These are also international standards. All the ships have to be designed to fit down there. So these structures, which are also given the same measurements and proportions that you'll find in cathedrals and temples, because for spiritual reasons, but also I think it's because of structural reasons as well, that these measurements and proportions are the ones that have worked throughout, and the buildings made of old have the right sound quality and acoustics, but also the wall's not too long so that it's weak, but it's not too short so that the house looks stubby. So there's even like if the roof is a little bit 2 inches too low, it can really make it uncomfortable. But if someone just lifted it a fraction or extended the wall a fraction, it can. So this is one of the things that architects have been arguing since the beginning of time, is the perfect proportions of a room, width to height to length. And these features have to do, so it's not just very scientific astronomy aspects, but weights, measures, proportions affect everything you do. The width of your car is, set to a standard of a road width, but we can look at that later. But even roads were designed at harmonic scales to have levels of information connected in them. We don't, but again, from the street plan to the top of the spire of a cathedral, there is this coherent, consistent plan revolving around these sacred numbers and geometry, sacred proportions. And so like in Freedom.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah.
Hey, Alan, I love what you said about the net and about the lattice work, and you can find your way to the center. It's kind of like jumping on a merry-go-round. It doesn't matter where you get on, you're in for one sweet ride.
That's it.
And that's what I love about this. But I was thinking about, this is kind of a bridge to Gilgamesh, and I know you're going to do that. Like Derek said, I'm not going to steal your thunder either. But if you take Genesis chapter 6, and I think it's verse 14, but it talks about the dimensions of Noah's Ark, okay? So here we are into a flood myth. And it gives the dimensions as 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Now, if you multiply that together, you get 144 times 2 to the 5th power. It's interesting. And you wouldn't think that out of those numbers, which on the surface don't have anything to do with 144, but they do. Just multiply them together. So that's that 5th dimension that you were talking about, right there with Noah's Ark. So you know it's there in the Babylonian flood myth, Gilgamesh.
Exactly. And it's a part, I believe it's part of a coherent system that's been passed on. Now, from Greek Roman times, we have very clear writings of it, but what we have is physical and mythological evidence of it going back quite some time. And even the Old Kingdom Egypt is a very mysterious still part. The records are pretty scant. But what we do have is the Egyptian royal cubit from that time, and the ancient. So we've never deciphered the Mohenjo-daro Indus Valley text, but we do have their weights and measures, and this is again like something you can be you can take to the bank in that respect. Now, like on so 144 amongst Rosicrucians, they believe in a music scale which would have 144 octaves. But also that there are 144 elements in their alchemy. So this is like another example of these groups. But okay, so now we see Epic of Gilgamesh, and this is drawn from Tablet 11. Now, just to do a quick history on this particular one, was written about 1500 BC. What we have is a even older description of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood, which dates to about 2500 BC, and that describes a round boat. So in here, we're going to see a description of a cube, but the older one describes a round boat. And I'd like to, but the Epic of Gilgamesh I'll be using is the 1500 BC one. Also because at that time, I know the Royal Babylon, I know the cubit that they were using. I have a good idea in regards to it. So in Tablet 11 Epic of Gilgamesh, on the 5th day, I laid out her exterior. It was a field in area. Its walls were 10 times 12 cubits in height. The sides of its top were equal its length. So what we have is a cube of 120 cubits wide, high, and long. So just like New Jerusalem, it's based on 12. So therefore, the total edge length will come to 144, or 1,440 cubits will be the total edge length. And the area of each face would be 14,400 square cubits. So but now I already mentioned the Royal Babylonian scale. So 120 cubits would be at that 1.5, that would be 180 Royal Babylonian feet. We can go into that, but that will be the measure. So 180 degrees in a triangle, for instance, or 1 + 8 = 9. Okay, so that, but that's just what I mean by it. Also converts in the Royal Babylonian scale.
You there, Alan? You're breaking up, brother. Getting poor connection.
Down, invert this
there you go.
into,
There you go. You're back.
English, it would be.
Hey, you're bumping in and out, brother. You're bumping in and out. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, your connection got real poor. And one thing I wanted you to go into, because I definitely want you to say what you just said we missed, but this circle story that predates this here, because that's fat. I mean, it popped in my mind. I can't let it go. From what we hear from people like Randall Carlson and other scholars and major movers in this movement, if you will, of the catastrophes and such, they knew how to square a circle. So could that be something that is going even further back, that there's a squaring of the circle concept of a circle boat? I mean, a circle boat doesn't sound like a normal boat either. I mean, I can understand if you say like a boat that's built like a boat, but to say the boat is built in a circle, I mean, it's kind of like, here, we're going to make a ball. And it's like, it just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, I'm going to shut up.
Yeah. That's cool. Do you want me to begin just with the Epic of Gilgamesh again? Do you think you got that recorded?
We got probably, I mean, I'd say 30 seconds before the time that you actually heard me cut in.
Okay, so I'll begin with Epic of I'll go through it quickly. The Epic of Gilgamesh again, just to get the ball rolling anyway. And so anyway, so we'll mention this number 144, and so the total edge length, which is one-dimensional measurement of a three-dimensional object, you could think of it that way too, is 144, but also the two-dimensional area of the preserver of life. Now, I should just mention this preserver of life comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh tale, which is where Gilgamesh goes to visit his ancestor Napishtim, who was the equivalent of Noah. He had survived the Great Flood, and he'd been, just like Noah, had been forewarned, and there was a time of sin and not so good society, and so it's very similar in regards to the Noah story as well, and quite a few similar. Now, for instance, in the Epic of Utnapishtim, when the rain stopped, he released a dove, a raven, and a swallow, as where Noah just released a dove and a raven. But we have that. This is one of the similarities. But this number 144, also describing this preserver of life. This is the Ark of Utnapishtim, but it's, as I've got it labelled, but the preserver of life is what it's called in the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, the boat to survive the flood. And because at this 1500 BC version, we have the actual description, but also the measurement. So that's why I'll focus on those. And that the round boat one, it's still interesting, and the descriptions is quite clear on the dimensions of it. But that's why I'll be focused. But this version of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the most intact and most complete as well. I mentioned Rosicrucians. Now, so in Mahjong, there are 144 tiles. Now these, because 144 lends itself to, it's a beautiful, now like another thing about 144, it's 12 squared. That's a gross. I think a gross is 12 dozen or 12 squared. So a 1 foot you still be using in America, like we haven't got metric like us, but 1 square foot is 144 inches. So that's like another aspect of 144. And so all of these numbers will break down to 9 or 3, but 12 whole thing, because it has to do with 12 inches to begin with. And so I can divide 12 inches into 3, and I have 3, and I have 4 inches. I can divide a 12-inch ruler into quarters, and then 4 quarters of 3 inches each. Now, unlike the metric system, if you divide it into thirds, you get 33.3333 repeater, or 66.666. So that's one of the benefits of now, if you look up metric versus imperial, you'll see one of the most hateful communities you'll find on YouTube. There is a absolute disdain for the imperial system. I was raised on metric. I had to learn it because I was working with old timers and they spoke in feet and yards, and I sort of had to get used to it. I didn't like it at the time. I was very like a metrification snob. But what is that metric is beautiful for simplicity, but imperial ancient units of measure contain multiple sets of information, but also once you do get used to them, they're actually more natural. They lend themselves to one another, because instead of metric, you have to think of every number. But when you start working with these numbers, it's basically 3, 6, 9, and 12. You can start thinking in a different sense, and because there's basic, like for instance, 1 plus 4 plus 4 equals 9. 144 divided by 9 equals 12. So the digits that make up the number, you add them together, you can divide that number by those digits. So that's one of the beauties of these numbers. But another way, the easiest way to think about it is the beauty of the number 9. And if you think of your 9 times table, so 9 times 2 is 18. 1 plus 8 equals 9. 9 times 3 is 27. 2 plus 7 equals 9. And 9 times 4 is 36. 3 plus 6 equals... Whenever you multiply a number by 9, the digits will always add up to either 9 or 18 or 27, in which case I'll break back down. So that's one of... most of these numbers, not all of them, but the majority of them are built around 9, and that's part of the underlying beauty of the math and the simplicity. And by using set at that particular level, it allows you to divide things into thirds and quarters, but it also allows you to, that there's all lovely math tricks that come off it, whether it's coincidental or however you want to look at it. But it's, again, you can play little games with it, but you can use it very seriously. And there are all these different aspects to it. So, but that's a tour of 144. I could now, while I'm here.
So Alan, so score one for the English system, the Imperial system, over the metric system. I was intrigued to hear you say that and talk about the benefits of that system. Here we go back to the conspiracy angle. Why the push for the metric system? What is it about the English system that we're leaving behind here?
I have some conspiratorial ideas. I think that this is sort of a battle that goes back over a long time, but that's very unevidenced. It's built on suspicions. But I think that, well, I mentioned the 7 liberal arts. And so traditionally, those were the type of school that you got education you'll get at a private school or a university going back in time. So the official beginnings of the 7 liberal arts was with the cathedral builders. Cathedrals were more than churches. They were political centres and also universities of the time. So the libraries would be kept there, so you would go to study at these. And the liberal arts was part of his system where you were expected to learn these subjects. They didn't have all the 100,000 different subjects we had. You would learn the 7 liberal arts, especially the quadrivium, and you would be trained either as an architect or an artist or whatever your profession was. If you had a grasp on those particular topics, you had a good basis to begin. So even like the term a Renaissance man, it's someone who's into music and into art and into architecture and into knowledge and science in general. It's a concept that you're interested in all things, that you're not. Now we're very specialist in our way. Like one of the first questions is, what do you do for a living? Or, it's not sort of, this is a way we define ourselves very specifically. But in this school, what you had was different. So before I forget, so on the topic of 144, so you see it applied in geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music. But what you'll also find is that it's a constant feature in architecture. Now, for instance, I'm showing here Amiens Cathedral, one of these great cathedrals. Now, to begin with, so the nave height is 144 Roman feet. So this is this older unit, and we can look at that. But what I mean by that is, now let me find the folder. So what we have there is Amiens Cathedral, which is 144. Now I've got to. Now that's at Romans. Now now I've just lost the folder I was trying to highlight. Just bear with me a second. Now my computer's freezing a bit now. Sorry. So what we have is Amiens Cathedral. It's 144 Roman feet in height. The nave. Down now. Sorry, my computer's just working a little bit slow. And so, the next image I'll show is Beauvais Cathedral, which is 144 what they call medieval royal feet in height. So that's being 2 examples of 144 being an essential unit of measure in the cathedral. And so at these cathedrals, they would often read from Revelations 21:16 and these related texts where they mention 144 with the concept. So Amiens Cathedral, and now if we look at Beauvais, okay, so there now now I've got my cards together. Sorry, now what we have is Beauvais at 104 medieval royal feet in height. We have Amiens at 144. Now from here we can just extend it. So again, back to New Jerusalem and all those references to 144 there. This is a very new cathedral. and its nave height is 144 modern feet.
Alan, this 144, it's blowing me away how far and how deep and how common this is in everything around us, these numbers. And I'm just trying to look at the text for a second, just how the text looks in the Bible. You get scorn when you look at the Bible. You look at the Greek myths. Oh, we're good. Yeah, that's mythology. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Those are numbers. Those are this, that. Yeah, it's mythology. Or it's astrological. Or it's parable. Or it's this and that. You start talking about the Bible, and that's like talking, politics, okay? It's very touchy. Don't go there. What are you doing? And so just wondering, is 144,000 esoteric? Is this something that is supposed to apply to the temple being man? And how that man is now, if you will, expressing the art of what is, I guess you'd say, divine in these numbers, by building structures using this numerical, I guess you'd say, code, if you will.
Well, exactly, yeah. So again, whatever the culture, we see the same things repeated, but even you look at, so where was the first Old Testament written, at least the Greek version, and that was in the Library of Alexandria, which was the storehouse of astronomical and engineering knowledge, for instance. But you'll see more and more, we'll see certain numbers and themes repeated, and the importance of weights and measures. And so I think like at the end of 140, I'll just finish off this 144 section. I think we could look at some of the classic symbols and origins and quotes of weights and measures and these morality connections in the Bible and these ancient texts. And so like first Christian church, again, new style, it's 104. So what you're seeing is the same in all sorts of churches. And but now, okay, this will connect to Solomon's temple. So what they have is 3 levels, and each one converts to 30, then 60 royal or medieval royal feet. So to reflect the levels at Solomon's temple. So that's often like the descriptions of exactly what that is. So all right, now that's 140. Now that 144 medieval royal feet, I suppose. Now I mentioned the Doric and the Ionic earlier. So while these images are up, but this concept of units of measure harmonizing. So at the Parthenon, the columns themselves, up including the architrave. So if you follow that line, where the rooftop, that's how you measure the height of the columns. But that's 48 English feet. Emerging, 2,000 years before that was officially set. And that converts to 45 Doric and 50 Ionic. So you had these different engineering teams, masons, all coming together on this grand site to work together. So one practical aspect is that every team was working with a whole number. Someone wasn't left off, in his unit, at 0.01 or something, They could, so that's one very practical aspect. But what you'll find is also these numbers will convert to all the harmonic series as well. And you have these are actually musical proportions, because you can simplify 48 to 25 to 16 to 15 ratios and 10 to 9 ratio. So musical ratios are in. Now even Doric and Ionic are also musical modes. So there's different ways of tuning, but there's Dorian and Ionian. There are also systems of measuring length, but also of measuring music. And so now, while I'm sort of on that topic, I think like what we have there is a mason's board, and this has, just as a quick example, because you have the finished stone or the dressed stone, but also the stone the builders rejected. So it's like one of these themes. And now, whether it's the level or the compass, the ruler and compass, the tilers, and the chisel. So these are like the stonemason's art, but you also see tools of geometry and tools of measurement, even music and the bell. But the square, the level, the ruler, the compass. These are all tools of measure and essential tools in the building trade and masonry. But you also see the 3 columns. So that's the Doric. Now it's partially obscured under there, but that's the Ionic column. And then we have the Corinthian column. So these are the 3 columns. Now, if you begin with the Ionic, that's the column of the woman, or the column of wisdom. And that's that column that has those swirls at the end. Now, they're said to represent the simple beauty of a woman's hairstyle, as opposed to, but that's just,
Alan,
so this is...
Something about the women, though, just touching on this, women being wisdom. This thing goes way back. You opened up a can of worms, bro, because Margaret Barker, who's a scholar in this field, connects wisdom and women all the way back in antiquity. Even, I mean, we're talking her opinion is the Bible is actually originally done by polytheistic people who had a divine mother or divine woman deity. And this wisdom, dude, the Bible is clearly indicating to me a Hermetic or a Masonic type of language here with what you're talking about, and the woman is somehow connected to this. We got to write that down because there's something going on.
Cool. So, yeah, well, even I don't. Firstly, just let me say, I'm not an insider. I'm not in one of these. I've observed everything from outside these organisations. But Oddfellows, Druids, and Masons, you'll see that they have a lot of their rituals are built around moral tales from the Bible. But even some of the older strains of Masonry have moral tales built around Greek gods. But in most of those initiation rites in Masonry, as far as I can tell from an outsider, but a lot of them have to do with moral tales as well, and these a moral journey as well along the way. And so there's this connection between that. Okay, so music and okay now.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah.
Let me ask you. Okay, if we were to, let's go back to Nassim Haramein, the theoretical physicist who taught us anew that man is the measure of all things. He's what lies between the infinitely large and the infinitely small. Okay, we see these huge structures reflecting 144. Now let's take a break and go in the opposite direction. Do we find things measuring 144 microns or 144 nanometers or something that is an extremely small measure? Does 144 still show up there?
Well, you could say like human hair varies, but at its widest, I'm not sure if it's 0.014. It's very close to that. So you could say there are those, but I think it's a bit like the point I said. If you measure enough things, you'll find, because everything has a variation in it. So if you measure enough, you'll be bound to find these numbers. But there are certain so 144 is a Fibonacci number, but you'll also see the Fibonacci series built into DNA. So Fibonacci numbers 13 and 21 define the DNA spiral. So even if a particular number is not present in a structure, or a number that will be very complementary and associated with it, from emerging from the same, whether it's Fibonacci numbers or harmonic numbers, you'll see that there is like a out of the infinite sea of numbers, there's a very small cup from which these are drawn from, and they're the ones that are repeated. And so I mentioned if I could do so I show this is one of the sculptures, a fountain here in Sydney. And it's an interesting sculpture, but this particular piece, what we see is the Kundalini, or 2 snakes connected to the rod. It's the Caduceus. There's different names for it, but I'll be calling it the Caduceus of Hermes. But that's the symbol of Hermes, or Mercury. Now, so this statue is labeled commerce, and it's shown as a female. But this is actually one example of this weights and measures knowledge and the legends connected to them. So it'll be like an intro how this particular sculpture connects, because weights and measures is the foundation of science. It's connected with Hermes, but it's also the foundation of commerce, which is why Hermes, the god of number and geometry, etc., is also connected with navigation and commerce as well. Okay, that's just an olive branch. We'll be coming back because this theme of the olive branch is an important one, and the olive branch with 13 leaves, which it will be referred to as well. But so this is like just an illustration, but it's one of the classical stories of Greek myth, is when young Hermes stole the cattle of Apollo, and it almost led to war on Olympus. But so Epic of Gilgamesh, these ancient references to specific weights and measures. We'll come back to this one, but also in tablet 11, he describes how much bitumen, oil, and was brought on board, and you'll see. So it's 3 times 3,600 units. So that's 10,800 units. 10,000. So this number 108. This is like another example of where these numbers will be repeated, but. This is a statue from China, and what you'll find is even now in China, which you wouldn't assume to have a lot of this, let's just call it sort of Masonic Greek mythology, what we have is the golden boy riding the flying bull. And this is actually a nice little symbol back to Apollo and Hermes. We'll come to that, but let's, for instance, in the Bible, I want to bring up the concept of weights and measures, especially in the books of law. So Zechariah 2:1, and I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. So that's like one. There's lots of revelations again. Was that a 11:1? Yeah. So then I was giving a measuring rod as a staff, and then you have a holy. Now 42 months as well. That's another number, but also you have a 1,206. Now 1,260. 1 + 2 + 6 = 9. So you already have one of those Hashad numbers, sort of mentioned in there. So there will be aspects that join.
Real quick, Alan, while we're here in Revelation 11, do you think that's talking about an actual, the actual temple that was said to have existed, or do you think this is something of a general rule of thumb or something of esoteric Masonic type teaching? Because, we're trying to pin it down. I mean, it just seems so coincidental that the Bible's temples, first and second, were both destroyed on the 9th of Ab. So, is this... It's too many questions, of course, I have.
Yeah.
But what do you think this is? Do you think he's really... someone's actually measuring a temple, or do you think this is something else like teaching you measurements?
Well, probably a series of both, because even just a actual temple, you'll find that everyone has a certain tradition. Now, you could go back to ancient Egypt. They had a ceremony called stretching the cord, where they would hold 2 stakes and stretch a loop of rope around them to form the main axis of the temple. In the Vasta Shastru, this ancient Indian architecture technique goes back maybe 6,000. But so when they design an Indian temple, they incorporate all different. So the arrangement of it is one of the most important steps. And I'll even try and start building on a certain day that might be auspicious day as well. But you can't build an accurate temple if you don't have an accurate ground plan. So that's where. And that's one of these concepts, it's sort of like measure twice, cut once, you might be familiar, So if you start with a solid foundation, an accurate foundation, then the building itself will emerge in perfect proportion, so to say, or at least as close to your intention. But that's, one of these rules of the cornerstone or the foundation stone as well. That's those cornerstone ceremonies, and even Jesus will be the cornerstone. Or, it might be, but the cornerstone is mentioned a lot in the Bible and connected with the plumb line. But it's also, so the plumb line measures accuracy up and down. You can hold up, is a wall straight by holding up a string against it. And a cornerstone is that from that rock, the rest of your house will be built. So the quality of a cornerstone is going to dictate, and the foundation will dictate the quality of your house. So again, it's a metaphor. So whether you're using a straight deal, but also a cornerstone is, we've built this on a solid foundation. So we have Masonic, as in, when I say Masonic, I mean in stonemason and construction. that there are similar morality and ethics connected to the concept of building. You want an honest builder who builds a good foundation, and these are terms which connect to even the way we live our lives. And that's why yardstick built on a strong foundation, on a square deal, or it's a fair deal. These are all morality connected with building as well, because you build a relationship as much as you build a house, and so these metaphors work pretty well with one another. So like Ezekiel will be another example of where you have references to measuring lines or etc. Now you'll also have case I think that's Leviticus 19, that you shall do no wrong in judgment in measures of length or weight or of quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, and a just ephah, and a just hin. And I am the Lord your God who have brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you shall observe all my statutes and ordinances and do them. I am the Lord. But again, I have honest weights and measures. My measuring tool is honest, and I'm dealing with people honestly, and length and weight measures and quantity. So it's a aspect of honesty and weights and measures. So Proverbs, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. So again, references, this is just some more Proverbs 20:10, and diverse weights and diverse measures are both alike an abomination to the Lord. So diverse, you don't have multiple measures, you have one set of honest measures. Now you find similar, like Deuteronomy 25:13, I shall not have two kinds of weights, of small and large weights. Again, I'll have equal honest weights. I'll use honest weights and measures in my dealings with people, and that this will please the Lord. So and of course Revelation with New Jerusalem describing the measurement of thing. Now that's now for instance, this is firstly horned Moses pictures. I won't go, but the measuring rod. So even the rod that Moses carried, the word rod translates to reed, translates to wand in ancient Greek. So a magic wand, and the wizards carried the wand, and the kings carried the staff. These were standardized sets of, this is the yard, this is the smaller, the battens that those that's like a symbol of my authority. But even like the measuring rod or yardstick as a phrase of honesty. Now magic wands, would be that would be the depiction sort of most people would associate with them. But that's an example. So that's the caduceus. So this is a GPO building in Sydney. But wherever you go, you'll see this symbol everywhere on art, but also on these the lovely old buildings. So you have these two snakes about the rod. That's the caduceus, or the symbol of Mercury or Hermes. That's the same building, just another example with a caduceus and the winged horns, like linking Mercury.
So Alan, when Paul writes in his epistle that he's a wise master builder, and he uses that term, and I can't wait, based on this discussion, to take a look at the gematria of that first. What do you think he's talking about?
Well, I think that's as they describe. So masons are no longer stonemasons. They don't build the way that they used to. And they say that masons now are trying to firstly build better men, but they're also working, it's exactly what it is. So I know this will be contentious, but the great work. And so the great work, all the elements of construction so building a perfect building would also, in a sense, go to deal with building a perfect society. And so that's what I mean with the Bible, I believe, has scientific knowledge, but just like with the seven liberal arts, there's a element of the quadrivium in there, but it's also mixed with a trivium, because you have books of law and morality, and which is very different depending on what era and what part of the world you live in at the time. But there tends to be this sort of thread of, so it's what, if I can, there are some things I can measure, that's great, I can prove and test these things, but so much of our life is built around much more nuanced. I had a side discussion with Derek about this. Now I can measure how long a foot is. I can measure the length of this boat. I can measure this, but I can measure the electromagnetic force. These are all things I can measure, but the power of love, for instance, is one of the most powerful drivers in our society. Now, it's an impossible thing to measure, but it's a force as important as electromagnetism affecting the way our society works. Now, but that's something I cannot measure. So this will go underneath the trivium, where how do you argue before a judge in a legal sense what is love? These are, it's an airy question, but it's also in the legal sense. Tell me what it is, because if do I love someone? Well, what does love mean to you? Now, the word God can have the same applications. Now, if someone asks me, do you believe in God? My real question would be, well, you tell me what God is, and I'll tell you if that's what I agree with. Because if you just say, I believe in God, people automatically assume you believe literally in a holy book, one of the choices. But it's a much more nuanced question. And what is God? That would be the question to...
Yeah,
and
Alan,
it's one of those impossible to define things in life.
that picture you have right there with this, what looks to be a cherubim or some
Yeah.
small cherub, okay, with that it's got the two snakes and then it's got the wand. Is this what we're seeing with Moses lifting up the staff or the wand with the snake in the wilderness?
Well, I believe so, yeah. So what you have is the brazen serpent, which is one snake around. Now, so what you have is this is the two-snake version, but there's another, so you often see it on the side of paramedics. Either I'll have the two snakes, but sometimes I'll have the one. Now, one snake about the right is the son of Apollo, Asclepius, who's the god of healing. So strictly speaking, the symbol of healing is a rod with a single snake around it, just like Ophiuchus, the constellation, but also Moses and the brazen serpent, but that's the rod of Asclepius. But the two version here, that's of Hermes, which is just science in general. So it's so that's like baby Hermes. He has the traveler's cap on and the wings on his brow. But that's just one more example of just... Okay, so now this is in Sydney. So what you also find is that these tales are, if you travel around Sydney, the major fountains in the major parks and the major, public memorials carry on us. So at the top of this particular fountain, you see Apollo carrying the lyre. So that's just like the constellation Lyra, but this is an important story because it connects Hermes and Apollo, and where does the caduceus and the wand come from? Okay, there's just a example of a vesica in stained glass, but that's not for the moment. So if I go back to that lady commerce, as in Hermes or Mercury is the god of commerce, what she has is the rod, but you'll see she's also holding in her hand a metal bar. And this is a theme, it represents weight and measure. So the rod to measure length, and the rod as a standard. Now sometimes it'll be a bag of coins or a bag of gold dust, but in this case it's a metal bar. Now you'll see this theme, so weight and measure. She's, now Hermes can also be depicted as a female in some cases, but that's a... Now this is an older piece of Mercurius or Hermes, again with the rod, and you'll also see him holding something in his hand. That's like because he's the symbol of weights and measure. Now he was also special because in Greek legend he was the only god who could travel back and forth between the underworld. So which is a sort of would be... in Egypt, we'll see that sort of same theme again. Now, this is a Greek god, Hermanubis, and all they've done is fuse Hermes, where he's got carrying the bag of weights and the rod of measurement, and they've just given him the dog's jackal head of Anubis. So it's Hermes and Anubis. That's an example of that syncretism, as we were talking about, Derek, with Serapis and these other ancient gods that got fused up together. Now, for instance, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, when you travel into the afterlife, that one of the last stages is you have your heart measured against a feather of truth to tell how many lies you've told in your life. Now, we see the scales, and now Thoth, the god of measure, he writes down the results, and he he calculates, your lies against the lies in your heart versus a feather of truth. But you'll also see a plumb bob scale. So the Book of the Dead, and especially spell 125, reflects it's pretty much the Ten Commandments are in there, and included in spell 25, the Book of the Dead is, I have not reduced the measuring. Now, before I begin, the Book of the Dead connections to the books of law. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, because you're going into the underworld, you say, I have not done this. As we're in the Ten Commandments and the Bible, you'll say, I will not do. But in this, it sort of measures, I have not reduced a measuring vessel. I have not reduced a measuring cord. I have not encroached on the fields. I have not added to the pan of the scales. I've not tampered with the plumb bob of the scales. So that's what that guy is. There's like a plumb bob on the scale. And there we see, so he's adjusting the scale. It's like one of those, to double check the accuracy of a pet. And I've not taken milk from the mouth of babes. So this is, again, you've probably heard that expression, taking milk from. Now these are from about morality and how to do well and deal well in your life. And this is very much copying the biblical text, and because weights and measures, whether it's a government or whether it's you dealing with your local neighbours, that you have standards and you keep those standards is one of the most fundamental ways of having a peaceful society. It's not the only way. There's a lot more to it, of course, but that with honest weights and measures, you have a basis for tax, commerce, everything to do, and deal. You want to buy some grain, you want to buy some wool, you want to buy something, that you have a basic standard, and that would apply to. So Egyptians didn't have coins, but they were using copper and other precious metals and weighing them out to a certain standard, and so they were able to have a price. So weights and measures connecting back to these things. That's okay. So now in ancient China, so Thoth or Sheshet in ancient Egypt, they taught the people geometry. They taught them how to read and write. But they also have the double snake. So this is Nuwa and Fuzi, and in ancient China, they're sort of like the creator, the gods of science. They taught people how to read and write and introduce civilization, taught them how to fish and hunt. And they carry the compass and the square. And they have, again, these two intertwining snakes as well. So just like that, Caduceus. Hunting, riding, fishing, domesticating animals. So even you see Thoth. Now I've just photoshopped an ibis head in there, but what you have is him carrying two rods with the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So he has the weights and measures, over a measuring rod, uniting firstly two snakes, but it's also a symbol of uniting Upper and Lower Egypt together under the pharaoh.
Alan, your question, your research inspires these big questions. I think you know that by now, on the part of Derek and myself. When you how do I say this? Human beings are characterized by different weights and measures, different numbers. We're born on different birthdays, under different circumstances. We weigh a different amount. We are different heights, for example, right?
Yep.
And yet we are challenged that when we come together, we see these rules in sacred texts about, no, your weight and measure has to be consistent. It's got to be the same. Is that some way of the cosmos, I don't want to say correcting for, but somehow creating some basis whereby we can relate to one another, knowing that we bring different numbers to the table, and yet we are encouraged through the sacred texts to agree on what those numbers should be? What about that?
Well, I think, yes, it's without going too philosophical, I think that's an important question. So the concept of truth and honesty in dealing, that would be one legal aspect. But when we all, very much like language, if we all have a common language and common words, we feel comfortable with one another, and a stranger becomes a friend very quickly with, because we have an agreed, and these are the things we all share. Now, if someone enjoys a hamburger, and and knows what Coca-Cola is, you've already got a lot of connections, similarities between one another. So we Australians and you Americans, we share English, and we share certain foods as well. So immediately we've got a halfway to a bond of dealing well with one another. But I think the importance of weights and measures is that these are universally accepted, guaranteed truths, like a foundation. If everything else we disagree on, a foot is a foot, an ounce is, and a pound is a pound, and a dollar is a dollar, because this would also come into, because it's incorporated in the same general area. But that's the difference between the quadrivium and the trivium. The quadrivium is beautiful because it's very simple. It's black and white in many ways. It just follows a clear path, and so you can follow that. But in real life, just so on a piece of paper, I can design the perfect building, but making that building in real life is more difficult. In summer, it's cold and it's going to change size. Sorry, in summer and winter, the cold and the heat will change its size, and so what's on the paper will never actually be reflected to the atom accurately. You know, there's always a margin of error built into the real world. Now, you can do perfect maths on paper, but it's applying that in the real world is a different set of discipline as well, and levels of understanding. But
that's a serious level of discipline. I'm still like in kindergarten, okay? I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm going, okay, just imagining people capable of this is like, it's going to sound funny, but it's like the people who sit there and say that the pyramids are built by aliens, okay? It's like, well, they're so higher intellectually and capable of disciplining themselves to this extreme, we might as well call them aliens, because these guys are like brilliant, and then they incorporate it into all this science. This is crazy. Maybe our education setup is just not right, or I just don't know what to think with all of this, man. I don't know. But look, we've gone, just to give you guys an idea, we've gone 2 hours and 40 minutes. Let's wrap this up at the 3-hour mark. So that means we've got, I'd say, 15 minutes to wrap up and come up to conclusions, and then we can we'll have our closing statements, and we will definitely have another one of these, because guys, we only went through two major numbers, 72 and 144, and all they are is just split 144 in half. We barely touched anything else, and this stretched us this far. So I'm going to go ahead and silence and let you roll on, either Luther or Alan.
Anything to say, Luther?
Alan, we had a series of numbers that we wanted to cover. And Derek, we did touch on 153, guys. We didn't go into it in depth, but we said a little bit of it in connection with the Vesica Pisces and the fish theme. So, okay, I feel like we've covered some of the numbers that are on people's minds who may be familiar with the Bible, okay? But there are also numbers that don't come to mind that are found in the pages of the text, such as this last one. Maybe you could touch upon 273, Alan, because that's an example of one that is not familiar to me. Certainly, you introduced me to the importance of that number. I was trying to think now, what is that number? What is that a measure of? And I couldn't think of it. So maybe if you could give that as a final example of the kind of number that we encounter in the Bible, yet it's not common, and one that we're ordinarily familiar with.
Be careful, Alan, because 273 with you is a 5-hour show. So,
okay, well, just again, just it's a bit slow at the moment, but I'll show like the pentagon and the hexagram and how 153, 273 sort of begin with one another, and just let me get the.
Well, Alan, while you're doing that, let me read briefly the biblical passage that talks about 273, just to show you this is embedded everywhere. It's in the book of Numbers, chapter 3, and verses 46 and 47. And this is what it says. Boy, these verses aren't so innocent anymore, not with you around, Alan. So it says, and as the redemption price for the 273 of the firstborn of the people of Israel, over and above the number of male Levites, You shall take 5 shekels per head. You shall take them according to the shekel of the sanctuary, the shekel of 20 gerahs. Now, those are different measures. But what we were getting at is that 273, and it's given there in the text as a number in excess of the Levites. Did we catch that?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yep.
okay. Go, Alan.
I might just quickly add that the phrase stone to build was rejected, as well as several other key phrases that appear in this Masonic tradition as in Hebrew has a gematria of 273. But well, geometry, we'll look at the pentagon, but how these come back to weights and measures. So the angles and sun, earth, and moon as themes. These esoteric artworks, I could bring up countless others. But so the Mason's board again, where we have the sun, the earth, the moon, and the stars being themes amongst others. You might also notice the ark, which the flood story was also a standard theme, and the but okay, I should. So let's just break down the numbers we already mentioned, 72 and 144. But we can express them in so many different ways, and one way to look at it is through a pentagram. So the 5 points of a pentagram will break up to 360 degrees. That's 72, 144, 216, 288, and 0 or 360 degrees. So what you'll find is that these same numbers will appear in multiple forms in a complementary way. And so to begin with those numbers, each of them, so 3 plus 6 is 9, 7 plus 2 is 9, 1 plus 4 plus 4 is 9. So they're all Hashad numbers, and with the exception of 288, which is still a Hashad number, but because it adds up to 18, and then 18 adds up to 9. So it's still a 9 number, but you can divide 288 by 18. So therefore it's what's called a Hashad number in recreational number theory. Now also, so we'll be looking at the hexagon and the pentagon. This goes back to, as you mentioned, the macro and the micro. So I often say that the macro is the hexagon represented by 6, and the micro is represented by 5, the pentagon. So everything bigger than man is macro, everything smaller than man is micro. And so, and one of you mentioned it earlier, I think it was Derek, but the connection between 144 and 1728 as a reference to man is an important one. But in regards to macro and micro, that man is the difference between small and big is regulated by the size of man. But so to draw a hexagon, that's what's called the seed of life, and it's just by drawing a series of circles built from the vesica Pisces. So you just draw one circle, you draw another circle on the edge, and you just draw wherever they intersect. Creates a perfect hexagon. It's one of these beautiful laws in geometry. It's why beehives and all these other structures are arranged in that, because it's just the most efficient, best way to build a structure and to build walls. And so you can overlay that onto the compass and the pentagram. Now, I should also say, so what you have is 6 points. It's divided the circle into 6 in that flower arrangement in the center. You'll also see that each time these circles overlap, that cuts that angle in half. So by drawing this design, you've created a hexagon, but you've also divided the circle up into units of 12, which is how you can draw a clock. And this is an important, to divide the circle up into 12, as in 12 feet per inches, emerges from this geometry. That's basically the Star of David pattern. I think it will be a bit more clearer in others, but I'll be coming back. So now I'll be showing how the pentagon then will lead to 33, 153, and 2. So 273 the Levites, and then 153 fish in the net, and 33 years of Jerusalem being ruled by David, and Jesus being 33 as well. So these also apply to other cultures too, but I'll just be using that framework. But those first numbers were Hashad, so they divided by 9. Now this does not happen for 33, and it does not happen for 273, but it does happen for 153. 1 plus 5 plus 3 equals 9. 153 divided by 9 is 17. It's also, as it's a narcissistic number in that in the third dimension, 1 plus 5 plus 3 to the third power equals 153. And this is a number that all other numbers will, if you use that same pattern, 153 is a consistent. So we have these angles. Now, okay, this is Claude Bragdon. He's a very famous, not so, at least in the esoteric world, he's a famous architect and contributor to philosophical magazines, but his phrase about mathematics is a handwriting on the human consciousness of a very spirit of life. But in his works, he talks about the second dimension as in a square, third dimension as in a cube, and then the fourth dimension, the tesseract, which is sort of a common theme in Marvel movies. But so we have those, and I'll skip through them, try and get to the juiciest parts. Okay, so that number 153, it's 1 plus 5 plus 3 is 9, and then 153 divided by 9 is 17. So you have a link also to this number 17. Now in triangular numbers, you can just, 1 plus 2, then 1 plus 2 plus 3, etc. You follow the pattern. Well, if you add up 1 through to 17, you get 153. So just as it divides by 9, it's also, that would be one example. Now, in that same pattern, if you multiply the triangular numbers, we add the first 5 together and you get 153. So again, it's as we're in triangular numbers, you add. Now, if you multiply those numbers and then add the sum total together, you'll see you'll have 153 emerging. Now, in your common drawing tool, now the drawing tools we were given at school, so the set squares, those triangular rulers, they actually are loaded with some of the most important, that's not just some random angle, they're actually very full of information. And so the set square that you have is actually at the square root of, well, what I mean by that is that 4 of your set squares together to make a rhombus will make the rhombus inside the vesica Pisces. And it also includes that square root of 3, and we'll link to that number 1, because the best whole number approximate of a square root of 3 is 265 over 153. And there's more aspects to that, but I'll just, as an intro, so triangular numbers now also consider, so the number 33 is, it has interesting properties. Now, okay, just try and skip a few of these, because all these numbers reduce down to 153 in one form or another. If you just follow the same pattern, you could pause the screen and look if you're a math nerd. But now here's an interesting one.
Okay, Alan, since those numbers reduce into 153, one could say that 153 is a net, so to speak, that draws those numbers into it. John chapter 21 in the Bible. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to point out, I was seeing that I'm seeing so many things that you're saying. Okay.
Now I'll try and get to the chunkiest parts. And so as we go around now, for instance, you get to the number 216. So 1 cubed times 2 cubed times 3 cubed is equal to 216, or 6 times 6 times 6 is equal to 216. But this, again, one of these defining numbers. So what you have is these now 306, so 36, that's 6 squared. So 6 times 6 is 36, 6 times 6 times 6 is 216. So these numbers have that relationship. But if you look at 36 and how it operates in dimensions, so 1 squared times 2 squared times 3 squared is 36, 1 cubed plus 2 cubed plus 3 cubed equals 36. And so this relates to the magic number. So one of the really beautiful things that makes number 6 the most perfect of perfect numbers is that 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. So it's isolate in these perfect numbers. It's isolated in that sense. And so either 6 cubed or 6 squared have nice margins. Now, okay, so I mentioned earlier with that 144 and how in the dimensions it expands. Now, what you also have is 144 times 2, which is one of these pentagon angles, 288. This is a very important number. It's very little attention, but I think it's actually one of the most important. And now it is the most beautiful number in 4 dimensions, and by that I mean if you times 1 to the 4th times 2 to the 3rd, or that's 8, times 3 squared times 4 to the 1st, it equals 288. Now if you go down the opposite direction and you add 1 to the 1st plus 2 to the 2nd plus 3 to the 3rd plus 4 to the 4th, you also get 288. So in this sort of, so if you can, just as an example, that's probably the best way to, so you see how these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 also have a power 1, 2, 3, or 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, and how in 4 up to the 4th power across 4 operations, it's 288 is one of the king numbers. And
Alan, that's not possible. So 288 is the result, both ascending in power and descending. Sounds like Jacob's ladder.
Well,
sounds like angels ascending and descending. That's just amazing. Is there any other number that works like that besides 288?
There are some that are close, but no. But as far as I know, there might be some on a big spreadsheet on some computer somewhere. But at least as a begin. Now, the importance of that number 288, you'll see it in structures everywhere. But the first example would be the U.S. Capitol building is 288 feet high, and also the Mormon temple in Washington is 288 feet high. And so you'll see this. So these numbers would be, so the standard numbers, whether it's 72, 144, or 288, you'll see them as the basic units of the width or the height or the length of major public buildings and cathedrals. So this is like an easy way to identify a building which, say if it's 72 feet high, you instantly have a whole set of complementary numbers across complementary units of measurement, bringing together this system. And that's, like I said, you can, within this small group, you pick which one is most pleasing to you, or just randomly choose, and you'll find that it will repeat the pattern and follow through and have the same information regarding the quadrivium, especially. That's what you can be certain of.
Guys, I am blown away. I think this is a good. We haven't even gotten to 273, and we don't have time to, because nobody's gonna sit through and watch 4 hours in a row of numbers. And don't get me wrong, this stuff is unbelievable. We need to leave some room to get into these numbers, Luther, and these images. We can go into these same images and just go deeper, because I know Alan will. I really want to wrap these things up, because we need to cut this off before we hit the 3 hour mark. Do you have any remarks you want to touch on, Luther, before we get to how do people get a hold of Alan? How do they support his work, what he's doing? Maybe touch on some of that, or whatever you want to talk about.
Well, just in passing, what comes to my mind is, why haven't we learned this? What is it about our system of learning, both personally and institutionally, where we lack this, Alan? And I think you have pointed up these areas that are woefully deficient. And so we thank you for indicating that, and for coming on board with us and sharing your knowledge, sharing your insights. We can't wait to have you again. And you have shown us, if nothing else, that sacred texts are worth contemplating in different ways, in different dimensions. And you've demonstrated that so successfully. We can't wait to have you back. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I was expecting, the amount of time. There's so much information in regards to this, so it depends what angle you want to go on. But no, it's been great having this talk. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
We're going to be having a lot more with you, man. Because this right here, you just don't find this. This isn't something that you're going to just go open a book and I find it. You got to dig. And even if you find one book, you just don't cover everything that you're covering here in one book. So something very important, I think people need to understand. And the reason why I find it so important, because I'm big into the interpretive and understanding of the biblical text. it's a focal point of my research, is to understanding and opening up the consciousness and letting people see this is not only the Bible. This is much bigger than just that book. This is all humanity, and this is unifying, in my opinion. So, ladies and gentlemen, just how do they get a hold of you, and where do they go to support you? Give us some ways that they can see your work.
Well, primarily on YouTube. So we Sacred Geometry Decoded. I'll the link attached in the description. So that's pretty much the main way to go on. I don't really have much of a social media presence. I might be changing that in the future. I've started the steps. So I've got a Facebook, and if you stay subscribed to the channel, stay tuned. I'll start adding as they come on any contact links. But I've a comment section in YouTube would probably, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer those in the relation to any particular questions. But also if there's somewhere you want to go, I've got like nearly 1,000 videos up, or something like 800, 900 videos available covering a lot of topics. So wherever your city is, or if you want to look at the geometry, if you want to look at the measure knowledge, or as a particular city, or I'll probably have something where you're from or in your area to show that it's a part of a much wider, much more practice system, and you'll see these themes repeated consistently. And modern and ancient. We haven't really the ancient origins of this. So much information, and then how they all connect. Yeah, we really haven't even skimmed the surface at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these things.
That's the point. And so our audience only got a tease. They got to see one thread or two threads of the spider. And so that being said, also we got to get a PayPal set up, because people have got to be capable of being able to help your research. You haven't even began that process, and that just goes to show the character and the motivation behind your work. But this stuff does take time, and time is money. It's a measurement, okay? And so the scales of balance really should be weighing a little bit more in your favor on this, because of the hard work you've put in. And I think what we need to do is we need to get you set up on a PayPal.